The story begins in a quiet room that feels detached from the world outside, the kind of space where silence gathers in corners and waits to be acknowledged. This is where the author often finds himself when diving into the darkest parts of humanity, surrounded not by comfort but by the weight of testimonies, documents, transcripts, and the lingering voices of those who once stepped across the threshold between sanity and catastrophic violence. There is a certain stillness that comes when you spend years listening to people who have taken lives, a stillness that doesn't soothe but instead sinks deeper with every new case. It becomes a companion, a reminder that behind every killer is a tangled life, a storm of motives, resentments, fantasies, and choices that spiraled into tragedy. He never approaches these stories with the thrill-seeking energy some might expect from a writer in true crime. Instead, he walks into them the way one enters a room after hearing something shatter on the other side, cautious and steady, aware that what lies ahead is not entertainment but the unraveling of human limits. Mass murderers are different from serial killers. Serial killers move through time like shadows, returning to the act again and again. But mass murderers explode in a single devastating moment, annihilating the boundary between their inner chaos and the outside world. Their rage doesn't simmer, it erupts. And the aftermath is always scattered with grief, confusion, disbelief, and the desperate search for why. The author begins by tracing patterns that repeat across these killers' lives, the quiet years where something malignant slowly grows unnoticed. They may appear ordinary, blending into their jobs, their neighborhoods, their routines, but inside them is a storm forming silently. Their grievances start small, almost imperceptible. A comment that stings longer than it should. A sense of being overlooked, undermined, mocked, or excluded. Feelings of failure that spread like cracks along the walls of their identity. Many of them retreat into isolation, where the mind becomes an echo chamber that amplifies pain and twists it into certainty. They begin to believe the world is stacked against them, that every injustice is intentional, and every slight is proof that they no longer belong among the living. This is where the seeds of catastrophe are planted, in the lonely corners of the human psyche where anger turns into a narrative, and the narrative becomes a plan. Every killer's story begins long before the moment they pull a trigger or swing a weapon. It starts in the private spaces of their lives, in bedrooms where they pace through sleepless nights, in workplaces where they feel invisible, in families where they believe they are misunderstood or unwanted. The author spends countless hours piecing together these histories, not to excuse them but to understand how they unfolded. He listens to relatives who still struggle to make sense of what their loved one became. He reads letters where killers justify their actions, trying to sound rational even as their reasoning collapses under the weight of delusion. He notices how often these individuals crave significance. They want their anger to matter. They want the world to recognize the suffering they believe they endured. Some write manifestos, long and rambling, filled with grievances against society, former partners, employers, political groups, or imagined enemies. These documents reveal minds that feel cornered, convinced that violence is the only way to reclaim power. They see themselves as victims long before they become perpetrators. And in this warped perception lies the heart of their danger. One of the most haunting aspects of studying these killers is how ordinary many of them look just days before their attacks. Neighbors remember them buying groceries. Coworkers recall them nodding politely in hallways. Some even carried out mundane tasks like returning library books or feeding their pets, in the hours leading up to mass murder. It's this eerie normalcy that unsettles the author the most. It suggests a dual life, a surface of stability, beneath which resentment coils like a loaded spring. When he examines crime scenes even long after the tragedies occurred, he doesn't just see chaos. He sees choices. He sees the path the killer took through the building, each step, each target, each place where fear filled the air. He watches the aftermath unfold through witness statements, hearing the tremor in their voices as they recall the moment everything changed. Survivors often describe the killer's face as disturbingly calm, almost detached, as if the violence belonged not to rage but to inevitability. This emotional numbing is another chilling pattern. Many mass murderers enter a dissociative state where empathy, fear, and hesitation vanish. They become consumed by the idea that this final act is their only release. The author also delves into the psychological mechanisms that push these individuals toward such extreme destruction. Some share traits with classic psychopaths: a lack of empathy, a shallow emotional life, a manipulative streak, but many do not fit the traditional mold. Mass murder is less about prolonged predation and more about collapse, a moment when years of anger and frustration combine into a single catastrophic decision. They are not hunters in the way serial killers are, they are imploders. Their violence is a dying star collapsing inward and bursting outward all at once. As he prepares to explore specific cases, he feels the familiar heaviness settle in. Every story he documents adds another layer to his understanding, but also another scar to his spirit. Investigating mass murderers requires stepping into the darkest corners of the human mind and observing the moment it breaks. And he knows that as he opens the door to each case, he will once again walk into the storm. A storm shaped by pain, obsession, fantasy, and the chilling belief that destruction is the only remaining path. But he also knows that understanding them is the only way to understand the world they shattered. And so the journey begins, one case at a time, as he steps into the first life that crossed the threshold from anger into irrevocable violence. He begins with a case that still lingers in his thoughts, not because of its scale but because of how quickly an ordinary day dissolved into terror. The killer had been a man who drifted through life unnoticed, carrying the quiet bitterness of someone who felt cheated by every turn of fate. He wasn't the type who drew attention at work. He didn't cause trouble. He rarely spoke. Most people couldn't recall the sound of his voice. And yet, beneath this silence lived a mind that recorded every slight as if it were a wound, filing away each disappointment until the collection became unbearable. The author traces the killer's early life, discovering a childhood marked not by monstrous cruelty or spectacular dysfunction but by a steady rhythm of emotional neglect and social invisibility. Teachers described him as withdrawn, the kind of child who sat at the back of the classroom, staring out the window as if the world unfolding around him had nothing to do with him. His parents worked long hours and offered little warmth, not out of malice but exhaustion. He learned early that expressing emotions rarely brought comfort. It only confirmed how alone he really was. So he built a world inside himself, one where he could control every detail and where every fantasy seemed brighter than the muted life he lived. As he grew older, this inner world hardened into a refuge. He retreated into online forums where resentment simmered beneath casual conversations, where people nursed grudges together and fed each other's frustrations. These digital spaces became echo chambers filled with anger, blame, and warped validation. The author notes how many mass murderers find comfort in such corners of the internet. They gravitate toward communities that reinforce their darkest beliefs, turning what should be fleeting thoughts into unchallenged certainty. In these forums, the killer found reasons for his failures, explanations that never pointed inward but always outward, toward society, toward co-workers, toward strangers who owed him nothing but who became, in his mind, enemies. In the months leading up to the attack, the killer's behavior showed subtle shifts, the kind of changes that people notice only in hindsight. He stopped small conversations at work. He quit sharing lunches with the one colleague he occasionally laughed with. He began arriving earlier and leaving later, his presence stretching in ways no one questioned. He wrote long notes that blended self-pity with strange declarations of purpose, messages that sounded philosophical but were mostly justification for what he planned. When investigators later read these writings, the author recalls, they were struck by how the words circled around the same themes: humiliation, invisibility, entitlement, revenge. It was a script many mass murderers follow without ever meeting each other. On the morning of the attack, the killer moved through his routine with unsettling calm. He brewed coffee, checked the weather, and locked his apartment door behind him. His neighbors greeted him as they walked past, unaware that he carried more than a bag. He carried the final version of a decision that had been building for years. He drove slowly to the workplace, the same route he had taken hundreds of times. But this time he didn't feel the old dread of another day at a job that made him feel small. He felt something else, a rising sense of purpose, the twisted certainty that this day would finally make the world acknowledge him. The author walks the reader through the layout of the building, the hallways where laughter once echoed, the break room where people shared moments of normal life. He imagines how the killer's footsteps sounded as he entered, how the air must have shifted when the first shot rang out. Witnesses later described the sound as a sudden tearing of reality, a moment when ordinary time shattered. Some hid. Some froze. Some tried to run. But most simply couldn't process that a co-worker, someone they passed every day without thought, had turned into a storm of violence. What struck survivors most was the killer's expression. He wasn't enraged, screaming, or wild-eyed. He looked detached, almost peaceful, as if he had waited too long for this release. This emotional disconnect terrifies the author more than the violence itself. It reveals the complete collapse of empathy, the moment when another person stops being a human being and becomes a symbol in the killer's internal narrative. Every bullet fired is not just an act of destruction but a statement: now you will see me. After the attack, the building stood silent, with broken glass reflecting the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. The author arrived days later, stepping through corridors marked by grief counselors' footsteps, investigative crews, and the lingering sense of shock. He noticed abandoned desks, half-finished lunches, small personal items left behind when people fled. These details tell stories that official reports never fully capture. They show lives interrupted, routines forever changed, and the devastating ripple effect of a single violent decision. He studied the killer's final hours, learning how the man didn't flee or plan an escape. Many mass murderers don't. Their violence is not designed for survival. It is designed for impact. It is the culmination of years of feeling unseen, condensed into a single catastrophic moment. When police approached, he didn't resist. Some killers end their own lives, but others surrender with an eerie calm that chills even seasoned officers. This man sat quietly, almost relieved, as if he had finally completed a task that had overshadowed every part of his existence. When interrogators later asked him why he did it, his answers were flat and repetitive, circling the same grievances found in his writings. He believed he had been pushed, cornered, disrespected, overlooked. He believed the world owed him attention, and when it refused, he took it by force. The author reflects on how predictable these motives have become, how they form a pattern seen in case after case. Yet each story carries its own unique tragedy, because behind every act of violence are victims whose names deserve more attention than the killers. He leaves this case with a heavy heart, knowing that while the details differ, the core remains the same, a person whose internal world warped into a weapon. As he moves toward the next case, he carries the weight of those who never returned home that day, and the haunting realization that mass murder is rarely born from sudden madness. It grows, quietly and steadily, in the shadows of everyday life. And with that understanding, he turns toward another story, one that reveals a new shape of rage, a different path to the same devastating end. The next case draws him into the disturbing territory of school shootings, a phenomenon that feels uniquely heartbreaking because it unfolds in hallways meant for learning, growth, and innocence. The author approaches this story slowly, almost cautiously, as though the memories contained within it might react to sudden movements. What unsettles him most about these tragedies is how they combine youth with unimaginable brutality. They force society to confront the uncomfortable truth that violence doesn't always come from hardened criminals or adults worn down by decades of resentment. Sometimes, it rises from teenagers who haven't even lived long enough to understand the full weight of their decisions. The boy at the center of this case seemed unremarkable to most who knew him. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't entirely invisible either. He floated somewhere in the blurred middle of adolescent life, where friendships form and dissolve quickly, where identities shift from week to week, where a single insult can feel like a defining humiliation. His teachers remembered him as quiet, attentive, and occasionally withdrawn. His classmates described him in fragmented pieces, awkward but not hostile, lonely but not threatening. But no one saw the internal world he carried, a world built from years of feeling like the outsider in every room. His home life was complicated in ways that didn't appear dramatic from the outside. His parents argued often but not violently. They worked long hours and sometimes failed to notice how their son's silence deepened with each passing year. He retreated into online spaces where other isolated teenagers gathered, sharing frustrations and dark jokes that slowly eroded their sensitivity to violence. The author notes how dangerous these digital corners can be, not because they directly encourage murder but because they normalize despair, anger, and fantasies of revenge. In these spaces, the boy found others who felt equally misunderstood, and their shared resentment became the soil for darker thoughts to grow. As months passed, he developed a fascination with high-profile school shootings. He read articles, watched documentaries, studied timelines, and even memorized the names of weapons. For him, it wasn't just curiosity, it was longing. He felt drawn to the idea of becoming someone whose name people would finally remember. His notebooks filled with violent sketches and rambling entries about how the world would only notice him after he shattered it. And yet, he still smiled at neighbors, still completed homework, still attended classes like any other teenager. The duality of his life became almost theatrical, a performance hiding the quiet collapse of his inner stability. What the author finds most chilling is the moment the boy shifted from fantasy to intent. It happened gradually, almost invisibly. He began taking long walks alone, rehearsing scenarios in his mind. He imagined the reactions, the headlines, the stunned expressions of those who laughed at him. He wasn't driven by pure hatred but by a profound desire to feel significant for the first time in his life. This craving for recognition, twisted by isolation and obsession, hardened into a mission. In the weeks before the attack, teachers did notice changes. His posture stiffened. His expressions grew more distant. When classmates tried to joke with him, he responded with flat, emotionless stares. But because he never caused disruptions, no one imagined he might be planning something catastrophic. The author reflects here on the failures in identifying early warning signs, not because people don't care, but because the line between typical teenage moodiness and dangerous withdrawal is often impossibly thin. The morning of the attack carried an eerie sense of normalcy. He woke early, dressed carefully, and ate breakfast with a steady calm that would later disturb investigators. As he walked to school, he carried his bag tightly against his chest, not out of fear but resolve. The school grounds buzzed with the familiar energy of students exchanging quick greetings, laughing at inside jokes, or hurrying to first period. He moved through the crowd unnoticed, blending into the sea of backpacks and hurried footsteps. Inside, he walked straight to the hallway he had chosen after months of studying the building's structure. He knew where students clustered between classes, where teachers stood, where the sound of the first scream would echo loudest. When he reached the designated spot, he didn't hesitate. The first shot rang out, slicing through the early morning chatter like a violent interruption of innocence. Panic erupted instantly. Students scrambled, books flew, sneakers raced across the polished floor. Teachers shouted for everyone to run. The entire environment transformed in seconds from a place of safety to a labyrinth of fear. The author imagines the boy's face during those moments, not twisted with rage but eerily blank, as though he had stepped outside himself and become an observer to his own horror. This absence of emotion mirrors what he has seen in many other school shooters. A sense of detachment, as if the violence is a final performance rather than an expression of anger. The boy moved through the hallway methodically, each step deliberate, each shot fired with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed the scene too many times in his mind. The chaos that followed was overwhelming. Classrooms went into lockdown. Students hid under desks or behind cabinets, crying silently while clutching their phones, their trembling fingers dialing numbers of parents who couldn't comprehend the messages they received. In the midst of this terror, a teacher confronted the boy, trying desperately to talk him down. She pleaded, her voice shaking, telling him that whatever he felt could still be repaired. For a moment, her words seemed to reach him. He hesitated. His breathing grew uneven, as if the reality of what he had done had finally caught up to him. But the pause didn't last. The weight of his plan, the identity he had constructed for himself, was too heavy to abandon. He turned away, continuing his path until he encountered a group of students trapped in a corner, their faces filled with fear. Something shifted inside him then, not compassion but a crack in the dissociative shell he had built. The enormity of the violence he had created became undeniable. And with that realization came a wave of panic he couldn't escape. He ended the attack not by surrendering to police but by turning the weapon on himself, ending a life that had spiraled out of control long before that morning. The aftermath left the school community shattered. The author arrived days later, walking through hallways still littered with abandoned notebooks, overturned chairs, and the faint smell of disinfectant masking the trauma that lingered in the air. He spoke with teachers who struggled to process their grief and students who could no longer walk through the corridors without feeling the echo of footsteps that once carried death. Parents sat through support sessions unable to make sense of how a boy they barely noticed had become the source of unimaginable tragedy. As he studied the boy's writings and traced the timeline of his descent, the author was struck by how quietly this catastrophe had formed. There were no dramatic warning signs, no violent outbursts, no threats shouted in crowded rooms. Just a slow, silent unraveling that began years before the final act. This silence, he realized, is what makes these cases so haunting. They remind us that sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones that gather without thunder. And with that sobering understanding, he turns toward yet another story. One that reveals how rage can take root not in isolation but in the heart of a fractured family, where love and resentment grow side by side until one destroys the other. The next case pulls him into the intimate and devastating world of familicide, where violence erupts not in public spaces or crowded hallways but inside the walls meant to shelter love, trust, and the rhythms of ordinary life. These are the crimes that chill the author in a different way. Mass murders committed against strangers reveal universal human vulnerability, but when the victims are spouses, children, parents, or siblings, the betrayal sinks deeper. Home should be the safest place in a life, yet in these tragedies, the home becomes a silent witness to rage that has been fermenting behind closed doors for years. This particular case centers on a man who, from the outside, embodied stability. He had a respectable job, a family that posed for smiling photographs at holiday gatherings, and a house that radiated middle-class comfort. Neighbors remembered him mowing the lawn on weekends, tossing a ball to his youngest child, and waving politely as he drove to work each morning. His life appeared orderly, predictable, and enviable. But beneath this veneer, he carried a growing sense of failure that gnawed at him with increasing ferocity. The author begins unraveling the threads of his story by speaking with relatives, co-workers, and old friends who sensed something off about him long before the tragedy occurred. He had always been a man who struggled with pride. Every setback, no matter how small, felt like a personal attack against his worth. When he was overlooked for a promotion, he didn't just feel disappointed. He felt humiliated. When his wife challenged his decisions, he didn't see it as communication. He saw it as disrespect. And when financial pressures tightened around the household, he didn't ask for help. He withdrew into a sullen silence that hardened into resentment. The marriage, once warm, had grown tense over the years. Arguments flickered through the house like sparks that never fully died. His wife tried to encourage him to open up, to share what weighed on him, but he saw these attempts as criticism. The idea of appearing weak terrified him. So instead of reaching outward, he dug deeper into himself, nursing the belief that his family didn't appreciate him, that his sacrifices went unnoticed, that he had become a spectator in a life he was supposed to lead. The author uncovers diary entries written by the wife, notes filled with frustration and worry. She wrote about feeling emotionally abandoned, about fearing her husband's unpredictable moods, about walking on eggshells around a man who could switch from quiet brooding to explosive anger. She loved him once fiercely, but that love had eroded into exhaustion. Their children sensed the tension too, the way their father's silence filled the house, the way their mother's shoulders tensed whenever he entered the room. Yet they continued living their lives, going to school, making art projects, laughing with friends, unaware that their father's internal world was collapsing. What troubles the author deeply is how the man's resentment evolved into a fantasy of escape. Instead of seeking help or confronting his failures, he began constructing a narrative in which his family was the obstacle preventing him from reclaiming control over his life. This twisted logic, seen in many familicide cases, reframes love as burden, responsibility as imprisonment, and dependency as betrayal. The man convinced himself that his family would be better off without him, or worse, that they couldn't survive without him, and therefore should not live at all if he decided to end his own life. This delusional sense of ownership disguised as protection is one of the darkest psychological turns in the cases the author studies. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the man's co-workers noticed he was distracted and distant. He stared blankly at his screen for long periods, failed to complete basic tasks, and occasionally muttered to himself under his breath. He avoided conversations, and when people asked if he was all right, he brushed them off with tight smiles. His wife, meanwhile, sensed a shift at home. His silences were heavier. His eyes looked vacant. He spent long hours in the garage, pacing in slow circles, lost in thoughts no one could reach. On the night of the attack, there were no arguments, no shouting, no final escalation that signaled imminent danger. The evening unfolded like any other. Dinner was eaten quietly. Dishes were washed. The children completed their homework. His wife folded laundry while watching a show on television. But as the family drifted into sleep, the man remained awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at the wall with a numb expression that masked the storm inside him. Hours passed. The house grew still. And then, with a frightening sense of resolve, he rose to carry out the plan he had rehearsed in his mind countless times. The author walks through the sequence slowly, carefully, as though each moment must be respected for its unbearable weight. The man walked first to his children's room. The silence inside was peaceful, filled with the soft sound of their breathing. He hesitated only briefly before the violence began. When he moved to his wife's room, she awoke in confusion, reaching toward him before she understood what was happening. Her final moments were filled not with anger but with fear and disbelief, a painful contrast to the years she had spent trying to hold the family together. When it was over, the house that once held laughter, arguments, birthdays, and whispered goodnights became a monument to irreversible destruction. The man did not flee. He sat on the floor surrounded by the remnants of the life he had erased and called the police with a chilling calm. When officers arrived, he surrendered quietly, offering no resistance. His confession was fragmented, filled with attempts to justify the unjustifiable. He spoke of pressure, failure, disappointment, of feeling like he had no other choice. But he never spoke of the lives he had taken as individuals, only as elements in a narrative centered around himself. The author visits the home days later. The quiet is suffocating. Toys remain scattered in corners. A school drawing hangs crookedly on the refrigerator. A half-folded blanket sits on the couch. These pieces of everyday life clash violently with the knowledge of what happened within those walls. He studies the space not as a crime scene but as a portrait of a family that never understood how close they were to unimaginable danger. What haunts him most about these cases is how preventable they might have been if the man had reached out, if someone had recognized the storm brewing beneath his controlled exterior, if societal expectations around masculinity didn't teach men to bury their struggles until they erupt. Familicide often grows from pride, despair, and the belief that admitting weakness is unforgivable. And when these beliefs twist deep enough, they turn love into possession and responsibility into domination. He leaves the house with a heavy heart, knowing that family annihilations reveal a truth many fear to admit. Sometimes the greatest threat is not outside the home but within it. As he moves toward the next case, he prepares to examine a tragedy born not from isolation or family tension, but from ideology, where belief becomes obsession, and obsession becomes a justification for mass destruction. Ideologically driven mass murder is a different kind of darkness. It doesn't grow from personal grudges or fractured families but from belief systems that mutate into deadly obsession. The author always approaches these cases with a mixture of dread and fascination because they reveal how an idea, something invisible, intangible, can possess a person completely, convincing them that murder is not just justified but noble. In these cases, the killer doesn't see himself as the villain of the story. He sees himself as a soldier, a messenger, or a savior, even if his actions leave communities shattered. The man at the center of this case had been described by many as intelligent, articulate, and oddly charming, the type of person who could speak for hours on topics few others cared about. But behind that charm lived a simmering anger toward society. He believed the world was broken, not in a philosophical sense but in a literal one. Every social shift, every political decision, every cultural change felt to him like a personal attack. He was convinced that he alone saw the truth while everyone else wandered blindly through lies. This sense of intellectual superiority, paired with deep resentment, formed a dangerous combination. The author tracks his early adulthood through interviews with former classmates and acquaintances. They describe someone who hovered on the fringes of every group, not because he lacked social skills but because he rejected anyone who didn't share his worldview. He spoke often about the downfall of society, about conspiracies that orchestrated everything from media narratives to personal freedoms. His conversations were monologues, lectures delivered with the escalating intensity of a man who felt unheard. And when people disagreed, he didn't argue, he dismissed them entirely. Over the years, he drifted from one ideology to another, collecting beliefs like armor pieces. Some ideas made him feel powerful. Others made him feel chosen. Eventually, he found online communities echoing his convictions, amplifying them until they no longer resembled opinions but commandments. The author notes how ideology becomes dangerous when it stops being a viewpoint and becomes an identity. For this man, the transformation was complete. He believed he was living under the rule of enemies whose actions demanded a violent answer. The most unsettling part of the investigation, the author reflects, is how logical the killer's reasoning sounded to himself. In his manifesto, a lengthy, meticulously structured document, he portrayed his attack as a moral duty. He wrote about history as if he were correcting its mistakes. He framed his violence as enlightenment, describing those he targeted not as people but as symbols of everything he believed was destroying the world. These writings were chilling not just for their hatred but for their calm, rational tone. It revealed a mind that had reached a dangerous equilibrium where violence felt not emotional but inevitable. Leading up to the attack, his behavior grew more isolated yet more focused. He stopped socializing, stopped working, and dedicated his days to preparing. He studied maps, floor plans, and schedules. He practiced with his weapons in secluded areas, refining his accuracy until it felt mechanical. He recorded videos where he spoke directly into the camera, his eyes cold and steady, explaining the philosophy behind his upcoming act as though delivering a lecture. To him, the future massacre wasn't chaos, it was a mission. And that is what terrified the author most, the calmness of a man who believed he had moral clarity. On the morning of the attack, he left his apartment wearing clothing he believed symbolized his ideological purity. He walked to his target location, a place that had become, in his mind, the physical embodiment of everything he despised. The sun was still rising, casting soft light across the street as people went about their day unaware of the violence approaching. He watched them for a moment, not with empathy or hesitation but with a calculated detachment. He believed these people were obstacles, not lives. This shift in perception marked the final transformation from man to killer. When he stepped inside the building, he moved with chilling confidence. The opening shots were precise, targeted, and devastating. Witnesses described how quickly the environment transformed, from the quiet hum of conversation to the sounds of screams and frantic footsteps. He walked through the space like someone fulfilling a long-awaited purpose, firing with the rhythm of a man following a script he had memorized. At one point, he paused to shout ideological slogans, phrases torn from his manifesto, not for communication but for affirmation. He wanted the world to hear not just what he did but why he believed he did it. The chaos was overwhelming. People hid under desks, behind counters, inside storage rooms, calling loved ones in whispers as if their voices might betray their location. The author reads these survivor accounts with a heavy heart, noting how trauma rearranges memories, preserving the smallest details, the smell of coffee spilled on the floor, the buzzing of fluorescent lights, the trembling in their own hands. These fragments become permanent markers of the moment their world split open. Law enforcement arrived swiftly, surrounding the building as the killer continued his rampage. Unlike many others, he did not plan to die. He wanted his message to survive, to echo through headlines and online discussions. He saw himself as the catalyst for a larger movement. But when the officers stormed the building, the shootout ended abruptly. The killer was wounded and taken into custody, furious not because he failed but because he wouldn't get to shape the narrative of his attack in his own voice. The author later sits across from the man in a prison interview room, a narrow table between them. The killer's eyes hold a cold intensity, a mixture of pride and impatience. He speaks clearly, explaining his beliefs without remorse. He describes his victims as inevitable casualties, and insists that history will vindicate him. The author listens, not to agree but to understand how ideology can distort reality so thoroughly that murder feels righteous. Leaving the prison, he feels the weight of what ideology can do when it grows unchecked inside someone seeking purpose. Unlike the isolated killer or the collapsing family man, this type of murderer is sustained by communities of belief, by narratives that reward extremism, by fantasies of grandeur disguised as justice. These cases remind him that ideas can be as dangerous as weapons when they take root in the wrong mind. He walks away from this case knowing that the next story he must face reveals a new shape of destruction, one rooted not in ideology or personal grievance but in sudden, explosive rage that detonates without warning, leaving no time for intervention, only devastation. The next case forces the author to confront a different kind of mass murderer, one whose violence erupts suddenly without long-term planning, ideology, or intricate delusion. This is the spree killer, a figure driven by a volatile combination of impulse, desperation, and emotional detonation. Unlike the meticulous planner or the ideologue who steps into violence with rehearsed certainty, the spree killer is propelled by a force that seems to ignite almost instantly. They move quickly, striking in multiple locations over hours or days, leaving behind a trail that feels chaotic but emotionally precise. Their rage burns fast and bright, consuming everything in its path before collapsing into exhaustion or surrender. The man at the center of this story had lived most of his life on the edge of eruption. People around him sensed something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint what. He was unpredictable, sometimes charming and charismatic, other times irritable and hostile without warning. His life was a constant swing between grandiosity and despair, a cycle that left him exhausted and ashamed. The author discovers through interviews that he often felt like he was drowning in his own emotions, but instead of seeking help, he numbed himself with alcohol, drugs, and sporadic bursts of aggression. His relationships were volatile. Friends came and went, drawn initially to his intensity but repelled by his sudden mood swings. He was capable of affection, but it was affection wrapped in barbed wire, easily tangled, easily torn apart. Romantic partners described him as intoxicating at first, someone who made them feel seen and admired, but beneath that admiration lurked jealousy and paranoia. He expected loyalty without offering stability. He demanded understanding without giving it. And when relationships ended, he spiraled deeper each time, convinced that abandonment proved he was destined for isolation. The author examines the final weeks before the spree, noting a series of events that pushed the man closer to the edge. He lost his job after an outburst at work, an incident fueled by frustration and humiliation. His girlfriend left him days later, exhausted by his rage and emotional volatility. These back-to-back losses stacked like falling dominoes, knocking over whatever fragile structure he had built to keep himself grounded. Witnesses later recalled seeing him wandering the streets at night, muttering to himself, his steps uneven as though pulled in different directions by emotions he could no longer contain. The day the spree began started with a confrontation at a neighborhood store. The man entered in a state of agitation, his mind spinning with resentment. When the clerk made a simple remark, meant politely not critically, something inside him snapped. The author imagines this moment with the painful clarity of someone who has studied similar cases countless times. These killers often describe the breaking point as a sensation of the world suddenly flipping upside down, a moment when every slight, every insult, every wound from the past merges into one overwhelming surge. It is not a rational process. It is a psychological implosion. The first attack unfolded in seconds, a violent reaction to a comment that, to anyone else, would have been meaningless. But to him, it became the confirmation of every insecurity he'd held for years. The spree was not planned, but once the violence began, he felt something addictive: power. After a lifetime of feeling dismissed, ignored, or underestimated, the sudden surge of control was intoxicating. He left the store and fled, his heart pounding, his thoughts racing so quickly they barely formed words. What distinguishes spree killers, the author notes, is the speed at which the violence continues. The man moved from place to place in a frantic attempt to outrun his own collapse. He attacked people who crossed his path not because they were targets but because they were there. Each act fed the next, creating a chain reaction of destruction driven not by strategy but by emotional combustion. Witnesses at the second location described him as disoriented, his movements erratic, his eyes wild and unfocused. He lashed out at anyone nearby, driven by a mixture of fear, fury, and self-loathing. As law enforcement began tracking his movements, panic spread through the community. Roads were blocked. Shops locked their doors. Families sheltered inside their homes, listening to the wailing sirens as news of each new attack flashed across phones and televisions. The spree lasted hours, though for those living through it, it felt like days. Calls to emergency services poured in, each one painting a picture of a man spiraling deeper into chaos. What the author finds most heartbreaking is how the spree ended. It wasn't a final confrontation with police, nor a calculated surrender. It ended with the man collapsing in a deserted industrial lot, sobbing uncontrollably, the weapon lying beside him. When officers approached, he didn't resist. He didn't even look up. He whispered repeatedly that he didn't mean to, a phrase that echoed with both truth and denial. Part of him had been conscious of every action he took, yet another part had been consumed by a psychological storm so powerful that intention blurred into reaction. In the interrogation room, he struggled to explain what happened. He described feeling as though he had left his body, watching himself from a distance, unable to stop. He spoke of anger that had been building for years, of never feeling understood, of being afraid of his own emotions. The author listens to these recordings and recognizes patterns seen in many spree killers. Emotional instability untreated, trauma unaddressed, social support absent, and destructive coping mechanisms that eventually collapse under pressure. Visiting the scenes afterward, the author is struck by how quickly the world tries to return to normal. The shattered glass is swept up. The bloodstains are washed away. Businesses reopen. But beneath the surface, the community carries deep wounds. People replay the moments in their minds, unable to shake the thought that they were simply living their lives when violence found them without warning. This randomness is what makes spree killings uniquely terrifying. There is no targeted ideology, no specific grievance, no predictable pattern, only the sudden eruption of a person who can no longer endure their internal chaos. As the author prepares to move to the next case, he reflects on how different forms of mass murder all share one truth. Violence is rarely spontaneous, even when it appears to be. The roots always extend deep into a person's psychological landscape, nourished by pain, resentment, fear, or delusion. Whether the violence is meticulously planned or explosively impulsive, it leaves the same aftermath: communities grieving, families shattered, and unanswered questions echoing through the places where life once felt ordinary. And so, with a heavy breath, he turns the page toward another tragedy. One shaped by a killer who blended narcissism with performance, turning mass murder into a spectacle meant for the world to witness. Some killers don't just commit violence, they perform it. Their attacks aren't driven solely by rage, despair, or delusion, but by a hunger to be witnessed. For these individuals, the act of killing becomes a twisted stage, and the world becomes an audience they've spent years preparing for. The author steps into this next case with a sense of unease because performance-driven mass murderers are among the most chilling. They want attention. They want legacy. They want their names to echo long after the screams fade. Their crimes aren't just acts of destruction, they're distorted attempts at immortality. The man at the center of this case had lived his life craving recognition. He wasn't famous. He wasn't distinguished. He wasn't admired. But he wanted to be. He was the kind of person who drifted between jobs and hobbies, abandoning each one when he realized it didn't make him exceptional. Friends, when interviewed, described him as someone constantly searching for an audience, someone who exaggerated stories, fabricated achievements, or manipulated situations just to keep himself at the center. He had a way of turning conversations into monologues about himself, as though talking about anything else felt like erasure. The author learns that in the months before the attack, the man filmed himself obsessively. Hours of footage showed him pacing in front of a camera, adjusting the lighting, rehearsing lines, and experimenting with angles, like an actor preparing for a role. But the content of these recordings wasn't creative expression. They were rants about society's ignorance, long tirades about how people failed to appreciate him, and chilling proclamations that he was destined for something historic. Watching these clips, the author feels a knot form in his stomach. The man didn't just want to be heard. He wanted to be unforgettable no matter the cost. As the man's obsession with attention deepened, so did his resentment. He became convinced that society had wronged him, that everyone who ignored him had committed a personal betrayal. He saw couples laughing, co-workers bonding, influencers gaining followers, and felt each moment as a reminder that he lived in the shadows. His ego couldn't tolerate this insignificance. He wanted to be feared if he couldn't be admired. He wanted headlines if he couldn't have praise. In the weeks leading up to the attack, he purchased equipment, cameras, tripods, microphones, and assembled a staging area in his apartment. He recorded videos outlining his philosophy, mixing shallow self-help cliches with radical declarations about societal collapse. He spoke with dramatic pauses, practicing the tone he wanted the world to remember. He wasn't preparing for a conversation. He was preparing for a legacy. The author notes that one of the most disturbing aspects of these cases is how killers turn violence into a brand, crafting an identity they hope will outlive their own lives. On the day of the attack, he woke before dawn and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He adjusted his clothes, rehearsed his lines, and positioned his camera so it would capture him perfectly. He filmed a final video, an unsettling mix of self-pity, arrogance, and performance. He declared that the world had failed him, that today he would make them listen. His voice trembled not with fear but with excitement, like someone about to claim a long-awaited prize. He chose a crowded public area as his stage, a place where the shock would ripple quickly and where cameras, real or imagined, seemed to be everywhere. As he approached, he wasn't nervous. His stride was steady, his posture confident, as though he was walking into a spotlight rather than a crime scene. Witnesses later recalled how he surveyed the crowd with an intensity that felt out of place, like a performer scanning an audience before delivering a monologue. When he initiated the attack, the violence was immediate and theatrical. He made loud declarations, shouting phrases crafted for dramatic impact. He moved through the crowd with deliberate gestures, pausing at times as if waiting for an invisible camera to capture the moment. Survivors described how surreal it felt, like watching someone acting out a twisted fantasy rather than someone losing control. His eyes remained wide and bright, not with anger but with the thrill of being at the center of all attention, even if only for a horrifying moment. The author imagines the chaos unfolding around him, the screams, the panicked footsteps, the sharp contrast between the killer's deliberate movements and the frantic desperation of those trying to escape. People hid behind vending machines, ducked under tables, or sprinted toward exits, clutching the hands of loved ones. Amid this terror, the killer seemed possessed by a strange calmness, pausing occasionally as though listening for applause that would never come. When law enforcement arrived, he didn't run. He wanted them there. He wanted the spectacle to escalate. The confrontation that followed was brief but charged with tension. Officers shouted commands, their weapons drawn, while he paced slowly in front of them, shouting lines that sounded rehearsed. For a moment, the standoff felt like a grotesque parody of a movie scene. Then, as officers advanced, he attempted to escape, not to survive but to buy time for his final act. He wanted his last moments to be dramatic, something viewers would replay endlessly. He didn't get the ending he imagined. The officers subdued him swiftly and the performance collapsed. As they handcuffed him, he ranted about destiny, fame, and legacy, insisting that the world would remember him. But in the interrogation room, stripped of theatrics and audience, he looked smaller. His monologues lost their rhythm. His confidence cracked. The author watches these final interviews with a sense of grim clarity. Without the stage, the killer became what he always feared most: ordinary, insignificant. In the end, his desire for immortality only highlighted his profound emptiness. He created horror not from hatred or ideology but from ego. He wanted the world to see him, but all the world saw was a man who turned violence into a desperate plea to matter. Leaving this case behind, the author feels a new heaviness settle over him. Every killer he has studied reveals a different fracture within the human mind: resentment, despair, delusion, impulsivity, narcissism. But there is still one more shape of mass murderer he must confront, one rooted not in rage or performance, but in cold, calculated cruelty that defies comprehension. The kind of killer who inflicts suffering not for justice, attention, or release, but simply because they want to. And with a deep breath, he prepares to step into that final realm of darkness. There is a category of mass murderer who terrifies the author more than any other, not because of the scale of violence or the shock of the event, but because of the intention behind it. These are the killers who act without delusion, without ideology, without emotional collapse. They act with cold purpose, driven by an appetite for cruelty that defies human instinct. They do not erupt. They do not break. They choose. Their murders are not the product of internal chaos but deliberate calculations made by minds untouched by empathy. When the author steps into these cases, he feels as though he is walking into a room where the air itself has been drained of warmth. The killer at the heart of this case lived a double life more flawlessly than any who came before. On the surface he was charming, articulate, even respected. He held a job that required responsibility and trust. He maintained a social circle that believed he was dependable and kind. Friends described him as someone who could talk his way into or out of anything, someone who always had the right words and the right smile. But beneath that polished exterior lay a mind that studied human behavior not to connect, but to exploit. The author pieces together his background with a growing sense of unease. From childhood, the man displayed traits that seemed harmless at first. Lying effortlessly, manipulating classmates, taking pleasure in subtle acts of cruelty. Teachers noted his intelligence but sensed something unsettling in his eyes when he watched others cry or struggle. Instead of empathy, he showed fascination. Instead of guilt, satisfaction. These early signs were dismissed as immaturity or phase-like behavior, but the author knows better. In many cases, the seeds of psychopathy sprout early, long before they bloom into violence. As the man grew older, he learned to mask his inner emptiness with charm. He mimicked emotions the way an actor memorizes lines. He learned when to smile, when to offer sympathy, when to show anger. He studied people carefully, identifying vulnerabilities with clinical precision. He became adept at controlling conversations, shaping impressions, and placing himself at the center of others' trust. This facade allowed him to gather what psychopathic personalities crave most: access to others' lives. But beneath that mask he was growing bored. Boredom, the author reflects, is a dangerous emotion in psychopathic individuals. It pushes them toward stimulation, risk, deception, cruelty, domination. And because they feel no remorse, their threshold for excitement climbs relentlessly. For this man, manipulation alone was no longer enough. He wanted something that would make him feel powerful in a deeper, more primal way. The motivation behind his mass attack was not ideology or revenge. It was fascination, curiosity, a desire to witness human suffering up close, to orchestrate chaos the way a conductor directs an orchestra. He planned meticulously, not because he felt threatened or angry, but because he wanted the event to unfold with precision. He selected a location with high foot traffic, studied security weaknesses, rehearsed his movements, and observed the routines of potential victims. The author finds these notes chilling in their detachment. No emotion, no personal connection, just logistical clarity. On the day of the attack, he walked through the crowd with calm confidence. People greeted him without hesitation, unaware that he had arrived to destroy the world they lived in. When the violence began, he didn't shout or express rage. He acted with chilling silence, methodically executing each step of his plan. Survivors later described his face as empty, expressionless, and mechanical, like someone performing a task rather than committing a crime. What haunted them most was his composure. He did not panic when people screamed. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He moved from one target to the next as though checking items off a list. The author imagines the scene in slow motion: the victim's terror, the frantic attempts to escape, the sharp contrast between human desperation and the killer's calmness. There was no remorse, no satisfaction, just a cold clarity that suggested he was observing the chaos more than participating in it. When law enforcement arrived, he didn't flee. He stood still, watching the officers approach with mild curiosity. He complied calmly, offering no resistance. In custody, he spoke with unsettling tranquility. He described the attack as an experiment, a chance to see how people reacted when confronted with life-or-death terror. He claimed he felt nothing during the violence, not joy, not hatred, not fear. It was interesting, he said, as though commenting on a classroom demonstration. The author listens to the recordings of these interviews with a mix of horror and resignation. The killer's voice is steady, his tone almost friendly as he explains the logistics of his plan. It is this lack of emotional connection that reveals the truth. He did not see his victims as human. They were data points, objects, variables in a psychological experiment run by someone who believed himself detached from morality. Walking through the crime scene afterward, the author feels the familiar heaviness pressing down on him. But this time it carries a different weight. There is no narrative of breakdown, no trail of resentment, no ideology to unpack. There is only the stark realization that some people kill simply because they can, because they want to feel something, or because they want to see what happens. These killers remind him that the human mind is capable of horrors beyond rational understanding. They force him to confront the reality that evil does not always come from pain or chaos. It can come from emptiness, from a lack of the very thing that binds society together: empathy. As he closes this chapter, he knows he is nearing the end of his journey through these varied forms of mass murder. But before he can step away, he must confront the final truth: what all these killers, despite their differences, reveal about the fragile psychology of humanity, and what their stories mean for a world desperately trying to understand the darkness lurking within it. As the author approaches the final stretch of his journey, he finds himself pulled into reflection. He has walked through so many different landscapes of violence: isolated men drowning in resentment, teenagers collapsing under invisible burdens, husbands consumed by twisted pride, ideologues sharpening belief into a weapon, unstable individuals erupting in chaotic sprees, and psychopathic minds acting with icy detachment. Each case felt different, shaped by its own circumstances and psychology, yet a strange and troubling thread ties them all together. The author feels it tightening around him as he examines the aftermath of the last case, a thread woven from the simple truth that every killer believed something about themselves that the world could not see. In the days following the cold, calculated attack he just studied, he meets with psychologists who specialize in extreme violence. They speak with a kind of weary clarity, as though they have repeated these truths endlessly but the world still struggles to listen. They explain how mass murderers often share a distorted self-image, a belief that their internal world, whether tormented, grandiose, or empty, is more important than the reality around them. Some believe themselves to be victims of injustice. Others see themselves as heroes in narratives only they understand. Some seek revenge, some seek recognition, and some simply seek sensation. But all of them, the experts say, share a catastrophic disconnect between their feelings and the consequences of their actions. The author writes these notes slowly, absorbing each word. He knows that the public often searches for simple explanations: bullying, mental illness, broken families, radicalization. But the truth is more complex and more frightening. There is no single path that leads someone to commit mass murder. Instead, there is a convergence: tiny decisions, painful humiliations, unaddressed emotions, untreated disorders, intoxicating fantasies, and moments of opportunity that align in disastrous ways. Each killer builds their own storm, brick by brick, belief by belief, until destruction becomes the only story they know how to tell. He spends time speaking with survivors too, and these conversations leave a deeper mark on him than any interview with a killer ever could. Survivors speak softly, as though afraid their words might awaken memories they are trying desperately to bury. They describe how life did not return to normal after the attack, how the ordinary world became foreign, how sudden noises trigger panic, how familiar places feel tainted, how trust in strangers evaporates. Some survivors feel guilt just for being alive, replaying the what-ifs in their minds like a broken tape. Others feel anger that burns unpredictably. Many cling to therapy sessions and support groups just to stay grounded. The author realizes that while killers dominate headlines, it is the survivors who carry the story forward, etched into their lives in ways the public rarely sees. And woven through their experiences is a painful universal truth: the violence may end in minutes, but the trauma lasts for years. In search of answers, he turns toward a deeper examination of society's attempts to understand these acts. He reads through countless academic studies, psychological analyses, and government reports. Patterns emerge, not perfect but meaningful. Mass murderers often feel disconnected from communities. They carry private grievances until they become unbearable. They often struggle with identity, purpose, or validation. They become obsessed with fantasies that offer clarity in a confusing world. And perhaps most alarming, they often leave signs, small, subtle clues that, in hindsight, seem impossible to miss. Friends recall conversations that felt off. Co-workers remember tension. Family members sense withdrawal. But because the signals appear slowly, stretched over years, no one recognizes their significance until it's too late. The author wrestles with this idea, how society misses warnings not out of indifference but because no one wants to imagine such darkness growing in someone they know. He sits one evening with a retired detective who worked on several high-profile mass murder cases. The detective speaks with the tired voice of someone who has seen grief up close too many times. He says that every killer he encountered had, at some point, talked to someone, whether through cryptic comments, written rants, or sudden behavioral shifts. The detective believes prevention lies not just in psychological profiling, but in connection, in taking small signs seriously, in checking on people whose inner worlds are collapsing, in creating support systems that make isolation less fertile for violence. The author isn't naive. He knows that not every tragedy can be prevented. Some storms grow too quietly or too cunningly. Some minds hide their darkness too well. But he begins to understand that understanding isn't about eliminating tragedy completely, it's about reducing the chances one life at a time. As he closes his notebook for the night, he feels the weight of every story he has uncovered pressing against him. The quiet man who felt invisible. The teenager lost in digital resentment. The father suffocating beneath pride. The ideologue consumed by belief. The unstable man in emotional freefall. The psychopath studying humanity like a puzzle. They are all different, yet they all remind him of how fragile the human psyche can be when isolated, ignored, or left untethered. He thinks about how the world reacts to each tragedy, with grief, fear, anger, and desperate searches for meaning. But he has come to accept that meaning doesn't arrive neatly packaged. Mass murder is a symptom of deeper fractures, personal, social, psychological, that require understanding rather than sensationalism. As dawn arrives after a sleepless night, he realizes he is nearing the end of this journey. But before he steps away from the darkness, he must confront one final insight, one that ties every case together, one that forces him to look at mass murder not as isolated explosions of violence but as reflections of the vulnerabilities embedded in the structure of human society itself. And with a quiet, trembling breath, he begins to write the final chapter in his long descent into the minds of those who chose destruction over life. As he moves deeper into his final reflections, the author realizes he's been chasing a single question from the moment he first stepped into this dark world. Why? Not the superficial why of headlines or courtroom answers, but the deeper, aching question buried at the heart of every tragedy: what is the human mind capable of when it feels cornered, empty, or electrified by delusion? Each case he studied gave fragments of an answer, but now, near the end of his journey, he sees the mosaic forming with unsettling clarity. He begins by revisiting the earliest cases he investigated, searching for threads he overlooked. The lonely man who erupted in his workplace wasn't born with rage. He built it quietly, brick by brick, fueled by years of resentment that no one else saw. The teenager who tore apart his school did not wake up that morning twisted. He grew into darkness slowly, shaped by isolation, obsession, and the seductive pull of online validation. The father who annihilated his own family did not strike out of sudden madness. He constructed a narrative of failure so consuming that destruction felt like the only exit. As the author reviews his notes, he sees how each killer's internal world became more real to them than the world they lived in. Their thoughts hardened into beliefs, and their beliefs became commands. They lived in psychological echo chambers where every insecurity magnified, every humiliation deepened, every fear transformed into a prophecy. In these private landscapes, empathy dissolved, reason thinned, and violence became the final chapter of a story they believed they were destined to write. But understanding the origins of violence is only half the journey. The author also studies what society overlooks, places where early intervention might have made a difference. He thinks of the teachers who dismissed concerning behaviors as mere adolescence, the co-workers who shrugged off alarming mood shifts, the friends who drifted away instead of asking deeper questions, the family members who mistook isolation for independence. He knows none of them are to blame. Humans aren't trained to look for the warning signs of catastrophe. Most people can't imagine someone they know carrying such darkness. He recalls a conversation with a forensic psychiatrist who has spent decades studying mass murderers. She explained that the roots of these attacks often begin in emotional wounds that go untreated. Shame, humiliation, failure, or loneliness. When these emotions deepen without support, they create mental spaces where fantasies become escape routes. And when a person's identity fuses with those fantasies, the line between thought and action erodes. She emphasized how dangerous untreated emotional pain can become in individuals who already struggle with empathy, stability, or self-worth. This idea unsettles the author. It means that violence doesn't erupt from nowhere, it grows from familiar emotions carried to unfamiliar extremes. In the days that follow, he meets with law enforcement officers who specialize in threat assessment. They explain how rare it is for mass murderers to give no warning at all. Most leave signals: cryptic posts online, sudden changes in appearance, purchases of weapons, disturbing comments, or withdrawal from social circles. The tragedy lies in how these signs often appear individually harmless, only forming a pattern in hindsight. One officer compares it to hearing raindrops. Alone they're nothing. Together they signal a coming storm. But people rarely notice the storm until the thunder hits. The author visits memorials built for victims of attacks he studied. These spaces are quiet, filled with photos, flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes, and candles whose flames shiver in the breeze. He sees the faces of people whose lives were cut short: students, parents, co-workers, friends. He thinks of the ripples each death created, how grief spread across communities like cracks in fragile glass. These memorials remind him of something essential. Violence may begin in one mind, but its consequences are carried by thousands. As he stands before these names etched into stone and metal, he feels a heaviness unlike anything he experienced when interviewing killers. With survivors he felt empathy. With experts he felt insight. But here he feels the immensity of loss, the way violence echoes far beyond its moment. He realizes that his work has always been about the victims, not the killers. Understanding the darkness is only useful if it helps illuminate the ways we might protect those who walk unknowingly toward danger. One evening, he sits alone in a dimly lit room, surrounded by stacks of research papers and notebooks filled with scribbled observations. The quiet hum of a desk lamp is the only sound. He feels the exhaustion of years spent confronting the worst of humanity. He wonders how the mind adapts to such darkness without becoming consumed by it. Then he remembers something a survivor once told him: "The world isn't darker than before. You're just seeing the shadows now. But shadows only exist because there's light." That single line settles into him with a calm he hasn't felt in months. He begins writing again, not about killers this time, but about the resilience of those who survive them. He writes about communities that rebuild, families that support one another, and strangers who offer kindness in the aftermath of terror. He writes about the counselors who sit with survivors through sleepless nights, the detectives who refuse to give up on investigations, the teachers who create safe spaces for traumatized students, the neighbors who organize vigils, the parents who advocate for safety reforms. In every tragedy he finds people who refuse to let darkness define their world. But even as he honors resilience, he cannot ignore the question hanging over every case he has studied: can mass murder ever be prevented? He doesn't have an answer. No one does. But he believes prevention lives in small moments: in asking someone how they really feel, in taking a concerning comment seriously, in offering connection to those who drift toward isolation, in breaking the silence that emotional suffering thrives in. He thinks of all the killers he studied. Not one was born a murderer. Each became one through a long, painful journey of psychological deterioration. If someone had reached them early, truly reached them, would their stories have ended differently? As he closes his notebook, he knows he must write one more part, one more piece that ties together everything he has learned. Not a summary, not an explanation, but a final reflection on humanity itself, its fragility, its strength, its capacity for destruction, and its even greater capacity for healing. With a deep, steady breath, he turns the page and prepares to write the conclusion to his long descent into the minds of those who chose devastation over life. As he moves toward the conclusion of this long, painful exploration, the author feels as though he's been carrying a weight that isn't his to keep. Each case, each interview, each crime scene visit has left a mark on him, sometimes small, sometimes overwhelming, but always present. The shadows he has studied cling to him, coloring the way he sees crowds, strangers, conversations, even the quiet moments of everyday life. He has learned that the human mind can fracture in countless ways, and those fractures can become fault lines that shift without warning, unleashing devastation. But he has also learned that darkness alone does not define humanity. The deeper he descended, the more he realized that the story of mass murder is not only about the killers. It is equally about the world around them, the one they chose to abandon, and the people who refuse to let violence be the final word. Late one night he sits by a window overlooking the city. The lights flicker across high-rise buildings, streets hum with distant traffic, and pockets of life continue unaware of the horrors he has spent years examining. He wonders how these killers saw the same world so differently, how they looked at crowds and saw enemies, how they looked at families and saw obstacles, how they looked at themselves and saw either a victim or a savior. He presses his notebook closed and realizes that the answer isn't about the world at all, it's about perspective. A mind in pain bends reality until it reflects its own wounds. A mind seeking meaning turns fantasies into missions. A mind without empathy sees people as objects. A mind starved of connection reshapes loneliness into hatred. He recalls an interview with a survivor whose voice trembled as she described the fear she felt hiding under a desk, clutching a friend's hand, waiting for footsteps to pass. It wasn't just the sound of the gunshots, she said. It was the fear that no one was in control anymore. Not us, not the teachers, not even the killer. It felt like the world had slipped out of its own hands. The author thinks about that often, the chilling idea that violence is never just an act. It is an unraveling, a ripping apart of the illusion that life moves in predictable lines. Days later, he meets with a community advocate who lost her brother in a mass shooting years before. She explains how grief pushed her toward activism, how she now dedicates her life to training schools and workplaces to recognize warning signs. She speaks with unwavering determination, her eyes shimmering with both sorrow and pride. People always ask me why I keep doing this, she says. The answer is simple. I can't change what happened to my brother, but I might change what happens to someone else. Her words linger with him long after the conversation ends, reminding him that loss often births a strength that defies explanation. His research also brings him to the families of perpetrators, people who carry a unique burden, mourning victims while grappling with the unbearable truth that someone they loved caused such unimaginable harm. One mother describes the night she learned her son was the killer. Her voice cracks as she recalls collapsing onto the floor, unable to breathe. I raised a child, she whispers. Not a monster. And I don't understand how those two truths can exist at the same time. The author leaves her home with a hollow ache in his chest. It is easy to condemn killers. It is far harder to face the grief of those left behind on the other side of the tragedy. As the author sifts through interviews with mental health professionals, he hears a theme repeated again and again: connection saves lives. Emotional isolation is fertile ground for despair, resentment, delusion, and narcissistic collapse. People rarely snap without a buildup, and that buildup is often visible if someone knows how to look. The psychologist who once spoke of storms without thunder now explains that most mass murderers live for years inside emotional cages with no one to unlock the door. If someone had listened without judgment, she says, some of these stories might not exist. He reflects on that as he reviews conversations with teachers who saw warning signs too late, co-workers who noticed subtle shifts but didn't think they mattered, friends who drifted away instead of reaching out. He does not blame them. Hindsight makes prophets of us all. But he wonders how society might change if people approached the troubled, the distant, the volatile with more curiosity and compassion. Not leniency, just attention. A question. A conversation. A small interruption in the path toward disaster. He travels back to one of the earliest memorials he visited, returning to the place that first made him understand the gravity of his research. Families still come there, even years later, laying fresh flowers, straightening photos, brushing dust from plaques. The author walks among these quiet symbols of remembrance and feels something shift within him. He realizes that these places are not just spaces of grief, they are spaces of defiance. They refuse to let violence dictate the narrative. They transform tragedy into memory, memory into legacy, legacy into resolve. As he prepares to write the final chapter of his book, he reopens the notes he made on the first day he began this journey. His handwriting was sharper then, untouched by the emotional weight he now carries. He wrote, "Try to understand them. Try to understand what breaks a mind so completely." He smiles bitterly at the simplicity of the words. Understanding killers is possible, he has proven that through years of study. But fully understanding the impulse to annihilate remains beyond reach. Some acts defy meaning because meaning requires empathy, and empathy is what these individuals lack. What he can understand, though, is the human context in which such violence grows. He pauses, staring at a blank page. He knows the final reflection cannot be an academic conclusion. It must be human, raw, and honest. It must capture not only the darkness he has studied but also the light that emerged quietly through every conversation, every memorial, every survivor's voice. Because in the end, this journey wasn't just about identifying what turns someone into a killer, it was about understanding what keeps others from becoming one. With a slow breath, he begins to write the last chapter, knowing it will shape how readers carry this knowledge forward. It will be the bridge between horror and hope, the thread that ties together everything he has learned about fragility, resilience, and the choices that define the human condition. And as his pen touches the page, he feels the gravity of every story he has chronicled, gathering like storm clouds preparing to break, not with destruction but with clarity. He sits in silence for a long time before writing the final words, the room dim except for a small lamp casting a soft amber glow over his notes. The quiet feels different now, not threatening, not heavy but reflective, as though the world itself is leaning in to listen. For years he walked willingly into darkness, spoke to those who had caused unimaginable suffering, stood in rooms echoing with memories of terror, and listened to survivors whose voices trembled with the weight of the unspeakable. Now, at the end of it all, he senses something he hadn't expected to find, a fragile but undeniable sense of clarity. He realizes that mass murder is not a single phenomenon but an ecosystem of pain, resentment, delusion, and emptiness that grows in the cracks of human lives. It thrives in loneliness, in isolation, in wounded pride, in ideological fever, in untreated sickness, in narcissism unrestrained. It grows quietly because so many people suffer quietly, moving through their days like ghosts inside their own minds. He thinks of every killer he studied and how each one, in their own way, believed they had run out of choices. And yet, in the lives they destroyed, in the families they shattered, in the communities they wounded, he saw proof that choices always existed. Ones they refused to take, ones they never reached for, ones they didn't believe they were worthy of. He remembers a young man who told him that the most terrifying part of surviving a mass attack wasn't the violence but the silence afterward, the long hours when the mind tries to rewrite the moment in search of meaning. I kept asking myself why he did it, the young man whispered. But then I realized the answer wouldn't heal me. What healed me was knowing that the world kept moving, even if I wasn't ready to follow it yet. That thought stays with the author as he considers how people rebuild after tragedy. Healing doesn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrives like small flickers, like someone offering a hand, a comforting word, or simply sitting in silence with someone who can't yet speak. One afternoon he returns to the office where he keeps his recordings. Boxes and folders clutter the shelves, each one containing a different chapter of humanity's darkest impulses. He listens to a few clips again, the cold voice of the ideologue, the trembling words of a survivor, the monotone confession of the emotionless killer. Their voices swirl together, but this time he doesn't feel pulled into their worlds. He feels grounded in his own. He has learned something essential, that understanding evil does not require becoming familiar with it, only seeing clearly the human fractures from which it grows. As he prepares the final pages of his manuscript, he writes not only for readers but for himself. He writes about how easily people overlook one another's suffering, how quick society is to label without listening, how much courage it takes to ask someone if they're truly okay. He writes about the teachers who watched students slip through cracks they could not patch alone, the co-workers who misread withdrawal as indifference, the family members who mistook quiet for peace. He understands now that prevention isn't built through fear, it's built through connection. A single conversation, a single moment of being seen, can interrupt a descent long before violence enters the picture. He thinks of a psychologist who once told him that human beings are not born to be violent. They are shaped, sometimes damaged, often neglected, occasionally broken. But they can also be repaired. Most people don't need someone to fix them, she explained gently. They just need someone to notice they're falling apart. Those words feel truer now than ever. On a cold morning near the end of winter, he visits one final memorial, one he saved intentionally for last. It sits in a quiet park where the breeze carries the faint scent of pine and the distant sound of children playing. Here, engraved in metal and stone, are the faces and names of those whose lives were cut short. The author walks slowly along the rows, touching each plaque with a reverence that feels instinctive. He thinks of their birthdays, their inside jokes, their favorite songs, their small routines that made up entire worlds. He thinks of everything they should have had: graduations, weddings, long conversations, years of laughter, years of growth. Standing there, he feels his throat tighten. It is not the killers he remembers in these moments, it is the victims. Their lives, their stories, their unfinished futures. And suddenly he understands that the true meaning of his work isn't to explain the darkness but to honor the light that violence attempted to extinguish. Each victim represents a reason to keep searching, keep questioning, keep paying attention to the quiet places where people hide their wounds. Their memory becomes a call to care more deeply, to see more clearly, to step toward one another instead of drifting apart. He leaves the memorial at dusk, the sky turning shades of gold and violet. As he walks, he feels lighter, not because the darkness is gone but because he finally knows how to carry it. Mass murder will always haunt the world in some way. But so will resilience. So will compassion. So will the quiet, persistent determination of people who refuse to let violence define the future. Back in his office, he writes the final lines of his book with a steady hand. He does not offer a moral or a neat conclusion. Life doesn't grant those easily. Instead, he offers a truth he has earned through years of listening to the shattered and the shattering. That even in the presence of profound darkness, the human spirit reaches instinctively toward connection, toward meaning, toward each other. And perhaps that instinct, fragile though it may be, is what saves us. Perhaps it is what always will. When he places his pen down, the room feels still again, but no longer hollow. The silence holds warmth now, the kind that comes from understanding, not fear. He closes his notebook gently, knowing this journey will stay with him forever, not as a shadow but as a reminder of what humanity must guard, nurture, and protect. He stands, walks toward the window, and lets the cool night air wash over him. The city stretches out before him, alive with 1,000 stories, some light, some dark, all intertwined. And as he watches the world continue on, imperfect but resilient, he whispers a quiet truth he now believes with all his heart. That for every person who chooses destruction, there are countless more who choose to heal, to rebuild, to protect, and to love. And it is in those choices, not in the violence he has studied for so long, that the true story of humanity lives. The journey is complete. But its lessons will keep moving through the world long after the final page is turned.